Good afternoon, everybody. It's wonderful to have you here. We have just completed our partnership meeting, which is an annual event. We have people from 5 regions of the world gathered together to discuss the challenges they have faced as women and as civic activists, and also to talk about what can we do in the following year within the context of our programs, which are largely focused on creation of participatory, just, egalitarian societies by way of encouraging participatory leadership that is communication based on respectful dialogue and listening to others and allowing them to take part in the decisions that affect their lives, and learning how to take that type of leadership model to communities and at various levels of interaction in their societies. So that's what we begin our day at. We have several days of this meeting annually, and of course our work is in 20 languages because our core organization is an organization of 20 autonomous organizations in the global south largely. So the partnership talks about the challenges, and as you all know, this year we have all faced huge challenges. The challenges have been really sometimes amazing and in their difficulty and complexity. Usually our state of the world and the state of women's world, or the focus of women on this challenges in the world, whichever way we look at our discussion, this year was especially depressing, you might say. But on the other hand, when we looked at what we can do together, it was amazingly positive and hopeful, because from far corners of the world, we had people describing their stories of activism, their stories of dynamism, their stories of creativity. And the very fact that people were sitting there from Beirut, Lebanon to Zimbabwe, from Brazil to Mozambique, and talking to each other with such good humor, such friendship, and such goodwill, and creating together new ideas, new ways of bonding and working. It was amazing. I'm sharing that with you because I think that everyone in this room probably shares some of that. That is the difficulties we all face, the new ways of separating us that have seemed to become normal, and also everyone's worried. I mean, conflicts and the refugees, displaced people, environmental issues, financial difficulties, poverty, hunger, all of the things that we see. So everybody is worried, but don't worry, WLP is there, and I think we're going to eventually solve these problems together with other like-minded people. Today, we are introducing our film that you're going to see in a few minutes. It's a film called Equality, It's All in the Family. The reason that we have chosen that topic is because we have been doing some active research, activist knowledge building that brought us to the understanding that the problems that we face, the emphasis on authoritarian top-down leadership, the emphasis on exclusion, if you win, I lose, kind of mentality, the emphasis on acquiring stuff and making more and more stuff for people to either acquire or try to acquire, the emphasis on not having cohesion and all of that, we have talked about what causes all of that. And since we have such a wide range of cultural contexts to work with, people have come to realize that a lot happens because the way people have been culturally and socially and in every other way have their minds actually formed from the very beginning of life. And that very beginning is in the family. And it relies on the structure of the family. And that top-down structure and that lack of inclusion and communication is really created. It is actually mine, I'm sorry to say. Thank you. Just, thank you. I think it's probably better to just wait it out. This is every speaker's nightmare, actually. I'm sorry. So, yeah, we were fixing the world with that interruption. So we've discovered that all of that cultural conditioning takes place in the family, and mothers are particularly good at creating that culture and passing it on to their children. And they are a victim of that culture as well as a producer of that culture. And what we need to do before we pass on this culture to educational institutions, to workplaces, to other institutions, we have to look at each other and our own role in the creation of that culture. And also, by the way we have compartmentalized ourselves as women, that we're focusing on our own issues and we're focusing on our own issues as victims. And saying that if we only had 10% participation, if we only have 20% participation, if we only have, finally, we have become very daring in the last couple of years and talking about 50-50 participation. We don't want 50% of a miserable world that is falling apart. What we want to do is recreate that world in a way that is good and positive for everybody, men and women, boys and girls. And in order to do that, we have to begin by restructuring the family. But this story will be much better told in the film than I can tell you. So what we're going to do today is look at the film, and then we have some brilliant speakers, some of whom you will see in the film. They are going to sum up some of the issues that they have recognized in the research that we have done and in the activism that we have taken on. So they will be having brief commentaries on the film and the topic, and then I hope we'll have plenty of time to have give and take with you, because this work on the change of family laws is going to end in a global campaign, and you're a test group because you're the first ones who will see this film. And we would love to have your reaction, because we're going to seek out allies and collaborators and cooperating organizations who will help us launch a broader campaign that is different than what our feminist theories have been somewhat, and it's different than the other side of the thing, the more hierarchical for sure. So we want to see how to shape and form this. Your questions, your comments are very much appreciated. And so I won't take any more of your time. I think Alison, who's our timekeeper, is getting nervous. And so we will just show the film first, and then the panelists will come and have their comments. Thank you so much for being with us.
Well, I am moderating a panel with really distinguished guests, and it would be wonderful if we could have them all speak at least a half an hour, but we're going to try to limit the discussion so that we have time for questions and answers afterwards. So I'm going to reluctantly try to keep us on a format where we will be talking about 7 minutes each, even though I know that's a bit of a tragedy given what we're going to be missing. I will invite our speakers to do whatever is most comfortable for them. If they would like to sit and talk, that's fine. If they would like to use the podium, it gives you a sense of masteries. That's fine too. And we're going to go in the order that we have set forth in this sheet here. And I'm not going to spend a lot of time on the introductions. These are extraordinary women with such a long list of accomplishments, each of them, that we would be using valuable time that we'd like to devote to the substantive issues if I dwelt too long on their qualifications. So I'm going to give very brief introductions. I hope that is not misunderstood as my slighting their wonderful achievements. And we will be starting out with Karima Benoon, who is in the area of cultural rights at the moment, and that is an area, if you're interested in human rights, that is often marginalized. It's very important. She is the UN's Special Rapporteur in the area of cultural rights, and she is the author of a book, Your Fatwa Does Not Apply Here, which is available for you to read. I urge you to read it. It is a fascinating account that I have not seen paralleled in any of the other things that I've been reading, because Karima has a unique perspective as someone who is equally grounded in the Algerian and American traditions. And as we know, Algeria is a country that has been through a very traumatic history with Islamic fundamentalism and struggles over women's rights. And this has given her a unique and extremely valuable perspective. Karima?
Thank you. Thank you very much for that very kind introduction, and really sincere thanks to the Women's Learning Partnership for inviting me and for the wonderful work that they do. And thanks to Mahnaz Afkami in particular for all her years of fighting for women's rights and also doing something which is incredibly feminist, which is supporting the struggles of other women for women's rights as well. So I want to sort of rush through my time and give a brief introduction to the provisions of human rights law guaranteeing equality in the family, and then addressing why claimed justifications of culture and religion provide no excuse for violations of these provisions. And then I'll just end with a brief note on my current work with regard to fundamentalism, extremism, and the cultural rights of women. Let me explain that I started working in the area of human rights because of my family's experience in Algeria during the War of Independence from France. And one aspect of this experience that always stayed with me was that my father, Mahfoud Benoun, and I mentioned him in the film, my father took part in Algeria's independence struggle and as a result of that spent 4.5 years as a prisoner of war. And I have never forgotten when he told me that it was when he was imprisoned by the French military during the war that he first began to think critically about the status of women in Algerian society, because as a prisoner of war deprived of his liberty, he found that his condition had come to resemble theirs. And I thought that was a really remarkable insight. And whenever people try to say somehow that it's, not in support of anti-colonial struggles, or it's a colonial enterprise to talk about women's rights in these parts of the world, I mean, my immediate personal reaction is to remember that insight of my father's. And he then went on to become a professor at the University of Algiers, and he spent the entire decade of the 1990s, as many Algerian intellectuals did, resisting the rise of fundamentalism at the risk of his life. And in fact, one of his very last books was entitled Algerian Women, Victims of a Neo-Patriarchal Society. And I wanted to explain all of this so that you understand the terrible irony that then this person who lived committed to secularism and equality, in death, his estate was to be governed by a family law with an unquestionable religious basis for its prescription for inequality, because that was not at all the legacy that he was seeking to leave behind. So just a personal note there. Today, women are facing a very difficult climate for all of these issues we're discussing all around the world, and that's one of the things that I appreciate very much about the film, is its sense of the global nature of these challenges. And I will just quote to you briefly a joint statement put out by UN human rights experts reflecting on this situation. And those experts included myself and the UN Working Group on Discrimination Against Women. And this is a statement from June in which we said that women's rights are facing an alarming backlash in many parts of the world, that we need more than ever to protect the fundamental principle that all rights are universal, indivisible, interdependent, and interrelated. And despite this unbreakable principle upheld in the Vienna Declaration on Human Rights, we are witnessing efforts by fundamentalist groups to undermine the foundation on which the whole human rights system is based. Some of these efforts are based on a misuse of culture, including religion and tradition. And that then makes my work as the Special Rapporteur in the field of cultural rights perhaps especially pertinent at the moment and especially difficult. So the question then becomes, how can international human rights law help us to tackle this reality of ongoing, pervasive discrimination against women, including in the family? Well, I think we have to go back these days to first principles and start by recalling that women's equality is actually built into the foundations of international law, of the international system, and of human rights law. And in fact, non-discrimination, including on the basis of sex, is one of the only substantive human rights guaranteed in the UN Charter itself, not even in human rights law, in the UN Charter itself. We then find across all of the norms that guarantee human rights, whether it's the Universal Declaration or the Covenants on Civil and Political Rights and on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, not only legal guarantees of non-discrimination on the basis of sex, but also affirmative guarantees of equality between men and women. And those guarantees are absolute. They do not have exceptions or exemptions for family or what is called culture. So every single text of the International Bill of Human Rights guarantees sex equality. Now, the committees, the UN committees that oversee these covenants have said very clearly that these guarantees of equality and non-discrimination mean that states have to do a number of things, including taking steps to adjust their domestic legislation so as to give effect to these undertakings. And that clearly references the thrust of the film. And I think all too often women's human rights advocates only focus on CEDAW, which is an incredibly important standard, but they forget about those underlying human rights norms, which remain so relevant, A, for states like the United States, which unfortunately haven't ratified CEDAW, or B, for the many states that have ratified CEDAW but have done so with crippling reservations. And many of those states are already bound by the non-discrimination clauses of the covenants, and we should not forget that. Now, there's an interesting contradiction in human rights law, which is that we have these guarantees of sex equality, of non-discrimination on the basis of sex, and at the same time, we have a centering of the family in human rights law without any definition or without any real description in the basic standards. So the Universal Declaration of Human Rights notes that the family is the natural and fundamental group unit of society and is entitled to protection by society and the state. And I think we have to ask ourselves what that means. What does it mean to say that this is the natural and fundamental unit of society? How do we define family? The Working Group on Discrimination Against Women has tried to have a very forward-looking definition of family, which I support, but they were attacked by many states when they put forward that definition. And today we see that the UN Human Rights Council itself is now dangerously adopting repeated, what are called pro-family resolutions without defining family. Now, protecting family has many very positive aspects for women's human rights because it is an important site and space for women. But family, as we know, as the film reminded us so poignantly, can also be a primary site of inequality, discrimination, and violence. And this is something that the UN Working Group on Discrimination Against Women has reminded us of. In their words, the family is a product of patriarchal culture and a vital institution for upholding the patriarchy. Now, the interesting thing is to see that CEDAW then tackles this seeming tension between the sex equality guarantees and the centering of family head-on in its Article 16. And there's no accident whatsoever that that is the article that has been subject to the most reservations. Article 16 provides that state parties should take all appropriate measures to eliminate discrimination against women in all matters related to marriage and family relations, and have to ensure on a basis of equality of men and women, inter alia, the same rights and responsibilities during marriage and at its dissolution. And again, remember that in the CEDAW Convention, states undertake to make changes in their national legislation to abolish discriminatory laws with regard to those types of substantive guarantees as included in Article 16. So if you look at all of this together, what you see is that rights respecting family laws that guarantee equality are actually required by international human rights law. They're not just a nice idea. They are legally required. And human rights law is clear that regardless of a state's reservations to the CEDAW Convention, family law that de jure discriminates against women is a violation of their human rights. The next question becomes, can culture or religion ever provide an excuse for such violations? And I am here, if I am here to do only one thing as the Special Rapporteur in the field of cultural rights, it is to affirm that the answer to that question is a resounding no. And by way of explanation, let me say a few words about cultural rights. Cultural rights are not about protecting a static notion of culture. In fact, in my first report to the Human Rights Council in 2016, I underscored that cultures are human constructs constantly subject to reinterpretation, and women have an equal right to participate in that process of reinterpretation. I also reminded the Council that states had already committed in the 1993 Vienna Declaration and Program of Action to the notion that it is the duty of all states, regardless of their political, economic, and cultural systems, to protect and promote all human rights and fundamental freedoms. So let's be very clear. Cultural rights are not tantamount to cultural relativism. They are not an excuse for violations of human rights. They do not justify discriminatory family law or violence. They are, in fact, firmly embedded in the universal human rights framework. Let me jump forward as my time is running out to talk about my current report to the UN General Assembly, which I will be presenting on the 25th of October, and WLP has very kindly made some copies available in the back of the room. And this report is about the impact of fundamentalism and extremism in diverse forms and all regions on the cultural rights of women. Fundamentalist movements are often proponents of discriminatory family laws, and they revile and threaten the women human rights defenders who seek to change those laws. I'm really hoping that you will help me, those of you who are going back to many countries around the world, to lobby in support of the report between now and the 25th of October. Time is of the essence because the instructions about what states are going to say in response to the report will be formulated soon. And feel free to catch me during the book signing if you'd like to talk about strategy around any of that. I can't make a full presentation of the report for reasons of time, but also because the report isn't officially out until I've presented it to the General Assembly. But I will just mention a few key ideas here. One is that at the heart of the fundamentalist and extremist paradigms, and as this is across different forms of fundamentalism and extremism, are rejections of equality and of the universality of human rights, making the unwavering defense of these principles the touchstone of the human rights response. When states undermine universality, such as through discriminatory family laws and the CEDAW reservations necessary to shield them, they aid and abet extremism. Another point that I make in the report is that governments must not make the mistake of thinking that they can use so-called nonviolent extremism, which we've been hearing a lot about, and pander to this phenomenon, including with regressive family laws, using women as the bargaining chip. The highest price for such blunders is paid by women, including in regards to their right to take part in cultural life without discrimination. Supporting women's rights, including in non-discriminatory family law, is an essential component of this rights-respecting fight against all forms of extremism and fundamentalism. The gender component is not optional. As Zainabou Hadari, a woman from Niger who has been involved in the efforts to enact a just family law there, said to me while I was carrying out the research for the book, Your Fatwa Does Not Apply Here, which WLP has also kindly had brought here today. She said to me, every step forward in the fight for women's rights is a piece of the struggle against fundamentalism. And I think one of those critical steps forward has to do with reforming family law so that it respects equality of women and men. And in fact, I think what is clear when you watch the film, what has been clear in my work as the Special Rapporteur, is that if there is no equality in the family, really it is very difficult to achieve equality anywhere. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Karima. Our next speaker will be Yakin Ertürk, who is also a UN Special Rapporteur, in this case in the area of violence against women. And her expertise in this area is embodied in the excellent book you have there, Violence Without Borders. I found it so informative. I learned so much from it. And there's something very interesting that still puzzles me. Why did we come so late to understanding that violence against women was something that had to be addressed in the human rights regime? And Yakin analyzes the history of our first ignoring this phenomenon and finally, slowly, belatedly grappling with it. She does so masterfully, and I strongly recommend this book to you. Yakin?
Thank you very much, Anne. And if you don't mind, I will remain here
As you like.
so that I'm closer to everybody. First of all, let me thank all of you, except our own partners, who seem to be half the population here, for coming today and sharing this event with us. I always feel, yes, we like to have full rooms, but those who come, I figure, are people who are really interested and committed. So I always am gratified with having those truly committed people. So there are many distances for us to all walk together in the future because things are getting bad, so we cannot relax. So thank you again for coming. Let me just say that I was a former Special Rapporteur on Violence Against Women, but these Special Rapporteur mandates are such incredible mandates, and I'm sure Karima is still at the very beginning of her mandate, that you never retire from them. And because human rights is a business that we all need to be vigilant about. And we former rapporteurs, as a matter of fact, are in the process of sort of forming an informal network where we can respond to human rights violations and have a platform for it. So it's in the making. This was a very interesting film. I had, of course, I was one of the stars in the film. But I congratulate again WLP, everything they I say here, I am part of them, I'm a member of the board, but they are the ones who are really putting all the effort into all this, and each piece of work that they produce is really remarkable, and it's a major contribution. Thank you very much, Manaz, and all the staff of WLP. Let me just start with a quotation from the late Eduardo Galeano, who has said in his book of Embraces, which some of you may be familiar, to punish disobedience and discipline liberty, family tradition perpetuates a culture of terror that humiliates women, teaches children to lie, and spreads the plague of fear. Human rights should start at home. Now, this kind of a description of the family makes people a little bit uncomfortable because our families are so dear to us. But that does not change the fact that human rights violations and the culture of such violation really is perpetuated and spread from the household. And I think this, what Galeano is describing is so universal, which cuts across classes. And that's why I have, as a rapporteur and as a social scientist, have been very sensitive to the concept of culture. And the culture mandate is relatively new compared to some of the others. Karim is the second rapporteur to hold the mandate. It's interesting, while member states use culture as a pretext for every human rights violation, that they felt they had to create a mandate. Now, these are all very dialectical issues. States create these mandates for their own purposes, but then, of course, how that works out is a different matter. And I'm very happy that people like, someone like Karim is holding this mandate, and hope that we can have, as civil society, control over who succeeds her, because these are very important mandates. So culture, I have witnessed as a special rapporteur on violence against women, and I visited 17 very different, diverse countries, from Sweden to DRC, from Moldova to El Salvador. What I heard across the board was, Madame Ertürk, violence against women is part of our culture. How can this be? You cannot argue that the culture of Sweden and Saudi Arabia or the culture of Moldova and El Salvador are the same. But for some reason, they all seem to think that this is embedded in their culture. So I always, I presented a report to the Human Rights Council on culture and violence against women, and emphasized the diversity of culture, and talked about a patriarchal culture. So it is patriarchal culture that says I should die if I did something wrong, not my culture. And I think women around the world have picked this, and there have been very effective campaigns on demystifying such uses of culture. Family law, whether we call it, to look at family laws, which are generally used to describe personal status laws, or civil codes, have this notion of patriarchal culture common to them. They have all been designed on the basis of the male head of the household. Whether we're talking about the very developed advanced countries which have done away with this term in their law years ago, or those that still carry it. But nonetheless, this was the foundation of family laws or civil codes. Let me just give an example. Now, I supervised the research component of the family law project of WLP, and 9 countries, case studies were included, plus 3 interviews from 3 other countries with prominent women leaders from these countries. And when the study comes out, I think you will all be interested in seeing the results. 2 countries among those which have secular civil codes, Brazil in Latin America, Turkey in a very problematic region of the world, which is itself very problematic these days. Early 20s adopted secular civil codes. And the Brazilian code was based on the French code, and the Turkish code was based on the Swiss code. So both countries, Switzerland and France, are not the countries you look at when you're talking about violence against women or family codes and so forth. But interestingly, although these were modern Western laws that we adopted, they were very patriarchal in a sense. And I will not go into the details, but interestingly, Brazil, I have only 1 minute left. This always happens to me. Brazil, of course, gave women political rights in, I think, 1918, or it's not, around that time. And Turkey, 1936, I believe, we got the right to vote and be elected. Whereas Switzerland, this right was given in 71, and France in 44. So, you know, this whole notion of Western, non-Western, modern, traditional or secular, non-secular, these are all very problematic concepts. And the WLP research on family law, I think, challenges some of these. And the evidence that came from country reports really is a testing ground of these binary opposites that we generally use in social sciences or political sciences to describe societies. Yes, secular laws provide women with a better opportunity to challenge the existing legal system on the grounds of rule of law and equality before the law. But nonetheless, let us not forget that patriarchy comes in many shapes and colors. And I did missions to countries like Sweden and the Netherlands, and they are included as a chapter in the book in the back, which Anne referred to. Some of my human rights colleagues at that time, when I visited these two countries, said, "Oh, you were trying to be politically correct." Well, no, I was not trying to be politically correct. The reason why I prompted Sweden, I may not have, because we looked upon Sweden as a country that has reached the highest level of equality among the sexes. Well, there were international media was covering research results on Sweden that showed very high levels of domestic violence. This was very curious for me as a social scientist. What does this mean? Why is a country like Sweden, where 50-50 is almost achieved, perpetuates such violence? And that's why I did a mission. And I uncovered really very interesting observations in both countries. And now, Lund University is carrying out a study on the paradox, Swedish paradox. So I think we cannot make overall assumptions. And patriarchy is a very strong analytical term, which is not very popular to use these days. But I think we need to understand the different shapes and colors in which patriarchy comes, which in repressive and regressive regimes and trends which we're living through today, target men as well as women. So this is an opportunity now for us across the board, North and South, men, female, women, to join forces. I mean, in my country, more and more men are joining feminists on street demonstrations because the transgressions on women's rights is coming too close to men's rights as well. Mm-hmm. So anyway, these are some messages I think that come out of the movie and will be taken up in the WLP campaign, and I hope you continue to follow this process and join us in it. Thank you.
Thank you. I now would like to introduce Joy Ungwakwe. And I think there must be at least 5 of you, because you are so accomplished and you engage in so many activities. It's a really impressive record, being the founder of the Center for Advancement of Development Rights and Development Rights. So that's a very interesting topic for women. And so many other activities in the area of human rights, community activism, researching, publication, training facilitation, et cetera. A very, very accomplished person whom we're very lucky to have. Thank you.
Thank you, Anne. Well, good morning. This is afternoon, right? Good afternoon, everybody. The Nigerian situation is a bit unique in that we don't have one family law that impacts the life of women. We have several laws. And then Nigeria is divided in, well, we have 6 geopolitical zones. But essentially, the country is divided into 2 regions. We have the southern region and we have the northern region. In the south, we have the criminal code at the federal level. And then we have the customary court system at the state and local levels. But I'm going to start with the northern region, where we have the penal code. I don't know if some of us have heard about the penal code. It's generally derived from the culture and religion of the community of the region. And so, just to give us a little example of the kind of stipulations that we have in the penal code, I'm going to read section 55D of the penal code that is in operation in the northern region of Nigeria. Now, section 55D has A, B, C, D, and it talks about corrective measures in schools, in the home. So D talks about corrective measure in the home between the husband and the wife. And this is how it reads. It says, nothing is an offense which does not amount to the infliction of grievous hurt upon any person, which is done by a husband for the purpose of correcting his wife, and husband and wife being subject to any customary law in which the correction is recognized as lawful. What this section is saying is that it gives the man permission to chastise, to beat the woman, provided she doesn't go away with grievous bodily harm, provided she is maimed. And we all know that this is very, very subjective. While what may appear grievous to you might be different from, but the thing is, the underlying message here is that men are given the permission to beat their wives at home. And that's just an example of this, of what you see in the penal code. In the southern region of Nigeria, we have the criminal code, which is largely derived from the Western laws. Yakin, thank you for that provision, because because it's coming from the Western region, it doesn't make it fair. But I'm going to talk a little more on the customary court system. Now, in the southern region, the customary court systems are headed by people who are not lawyers by training. Their only qualification is that they are custodians of the culture of a given community. By that system actually gives legal backing to the cultures and traditions of those communities that are gender discriminated and that encourage violence against women. So I'm going to go ahead and list and discuss a little of those cultures that are supported by the customary court system in the southern region of Nigeria. We have a disinheritance of women and girls. Under these laws, women, wives, daughters are not allowed to inherit property, either from the father or from the husband. Regardless of what the woman contributes in the process of gathering these things, they are not allowed to inherit. A wife may access property through the male son. That means when a man dies, the property automatically goes to the male child, meaning that if she does not have a male child, she does not get any inheritance at all. And this inheritance of women is one of the key tools for impoverishing women who have worked hard with their spouses to gather property. And this particular culture of disinheritance is very, very connected to the male child preference. Because everybody knows, every woman knows that if she doesn't have a male child, then she doesn't get to inherit. It gives the backing, it gives the legal backing to male child preference. You see a woman that has 7 children and she goes about telling people that she doesn't have a child. And she's treated as not having a child. You know, some people would actually tell her that in that family, her name is still written in pencil, meaning that she's not really grounded until she has a male child. And the preference, and the male child preference actually means that there is discrimination against the female child. It leads to denial of education, early marriage, and so on. And then that leaves us, I have just 2 minutes, high bride price. The thing about high bride price is that it makes women, they are like purchased items in the family. It denies them the ability, the position to make decisions in the family, because they are seen as just one of the items purchased, just like you go to purchase. This culture started actually as a way of creating conducive relationship between them, the families, you know, where gifts are exchanged between the male and the female. But as time went on, this culture now degenerated to outright selling of daughters to the highest bidder, and it's one of the things that cause violence against women, because if she speaks in that house, the man tells her, remember how much I spent to purchase you, to get you into this family. And that also leads to a lot of violence against women in the family. Child marriage is something that has been given legal backing in the penal code and in the customary court system. And child marriage has a lot of implications for poverty for women, for girls who don't get to go to school, and health implications of the VVF for girls who begin to have children at very tender age. So it has a lot of implication when children under the age of 9 are made, under the age of 10 are even married off. And some of them don't see their period before they become pregnant. So with their first menstrual cycle, they are already pregnant. And so these are ways that the law gives technical backing to the cultures that are oppressive to women and that translate to violence against women. While I was compiling this presentation, I just decided to do a little research to see what's happening in other countries. In Kenya, there is what they call the widowhood cleansing. It's a culture that requires a widow to have unprotected sexual intercourse with a cleanser chosen by a relative. The belief is to cleanse the woman of impurities that came upon her at the death of her husband. I forgot to talk about the widowhood practices that go on in Nigeria. When a woman loses her husband, she's isolated, her hair is scraped, she is made to swear that she had no hand in killing the husband. Whereas, on the other hand, the man is comforted, encouraged to remarry like 6 months, at most 1 year after he loses the wife. And then the bride price issue that we talked about. You know, there's something about bride price. It happens here in Uganda. There's an article that says that because of bride price is a very terrible tool for establishing, entrenching violence in homes. And the thing about bride price is no matter who pays the bride price, it leads to violence against women. In African countries where men pay the bride price, it leads to violence against. And then in some Asian countries too, where the woman pays the bride price, it still leads to violence against women. And so in conclusion, all of these, the culture, the stipulations of laws, because our laws have come to the point where they have absorbed the culture and the religious interpretation or misinterpretation, as you will. Culture and tradition, including those that are gender discriminatory, or specifically encourage violence against women and girls, have either been integrated into certain laws or laws and religious texts have been misinterpreted to match the culture and tradition of a given society. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. And now it's time for Jacqueline Pitanguy, who has a very impressive track record in campaigning for women's rights. And she has done marvelous things, including serving as the president of the National Council for Women's Rights in Brazil. The account that she gives in the forthcoming Women's Learning Partnership publication is going to be a collection of case studies and interviews on family law issues and issues also like violence against women. The study that she has produced for this volume is a very instructive account, and I think it's one that American women could benefit from because Brazilian women organized in a way that enabled them to make excellent progress in advancing their rights against what were really formidable odds. And a lot of that is due to Jacqueline Pitanguy.
Thank you so much. I was watching the WLP film. I always watch those films, and I feel like an emotion because they deal with universal issues. And when you deal with universal issues, sometimes you're tempted to say, oh, there's nothing to be done, you know, it's everywhere, always. And then you said, no, being universal is a window of opportunity. Being universal means that you can strategize globally, and that you can build global strategies, which is what the WLP does in having all these partners from different parts of the world, from such different cultures and yet so close. So I think the film brings proximity and at the same time calls for action. And I think that what I would like to talk about here mainly is action, and how can we organize, strategize, and change, even if we know that changes are not permanent, that progress is not unilateral, and that nothing is assured. But anyway, I think that what we have in common from all the wonderful presentations here and from the movie is the fact that there is patriarchalism in the world. It takes different forms. It is reinforced when it is backed up by religion, and then you have to deal with God, which is very difficult to negotiate with God. But when patriarchalism has to do with secular countries and secular states, it's easier, but it is still difficult, because then it will be rooted on a number of other very, very difficult barriers in relation to economic, property, etc., etc. So from this universal discriminatory family laws, either in religious codes or in secular civil codes, what we see there is patriarchal male domination of women. And this legitimizes and opens spaces for physical, psychological, sexual, and moral violence against women. So what I think that what we are trying to do with this campaign is to make clear the linkages between a legal system which is violent in itself and violence, what we usually understand as violence, because it has to do with physical aggressions, sexual aggressions, and it's what usually society perceives as violence in others, but frequently does not perceive when it happens within the home and with the women. But anyway, I think that this linkage between a legal system that apparently should be respected, honored, that gives a frame, a normative frame for a country, and violence is what the film shows and what the book will show, this intrinsic linkage between violence against women and family laws. Family legislation, I will call family legislation because not all countries have a family law code, but family legislation that gives subalternity to women, they are violent in themselves, and they legitimize different forms of violence that can be accrued when they're also backed up by religious values that, as Karima pointed out, are not there to facilitate our relationship with the gods or goddess, but that become religious forces and that act in political arenas. So I think that one of the most important agendas of feminism in Brazil was family law. And this, since the time that the country was under dictatorship, women were already trying to change the civil code, which dated from 1916. And it was highly patriarchal. Man was the head of the family. Being the head of the family He could have the woman leave her work if it affected the family, and he was the one who determined the residence, and he was the one who registered the children. It was the paternal family who had precedence over the children, etc., etc., etc. So this is not harmony, this is subalternity. And however, what is very interesting to observe is when you have a tension between what's happening in real life and the loss. And the gap between loss and life, it's very important for political action. When you have this gap, it's a way, to go beyond your own constituency, let's say, of women, human rights activists and feminists, and address women at large. Because at that moment that we still had the 1916 Family Code, women were already close to 40% of the labor force, and they were working and bringing money to the family, and they were going to the university, and the number of women in formal schooling was higher than men. And yet there we had those patriarchal laws where still man was the head of the family. So we developed a campaign. We used a number of advocacy tools, but this tension, this gap between laws and reality was very important for us to achieve with the new constitution, full equality for men and women in the family. And then now, of course, you have to change what we call ordinary laws, which is the civil code, the penal code, to be adjusted to the constitutional provision. I noticed there's, my time is ending, but I want to say something that I think it's very important for us who consider ourselves and who have had our lives mainly as activists. Nothing is assured. Nothing is assured. And laws, they are historical constructions. And as such, they can be changed. And it depends on the social forces that are playing in the political arena of a country on a given time, but also internationally. Because in all this, it's not only the tension between real life and national laws, it's also what's happening in the international arena with CEDAW, with all the UN conferences where you had a rhythm of affirmation of equality and women's rights. But what do we see now in this country? What do we see now in Brazil? It's an extraordinary, exponential growth of conservative forces, many of them religious. We have the Christian fundamentalism as a political force now in Brazil. And as all the fundamentalisms, doesn't matter what religion, their goal, their main target, it's women. And where is women basically placed, and the relationships of power are really there, it's in the family. So we are seeing in Brazil a number of initiatives from the parliament, from these groups, and then in parliaments they negotiate everything, especially women's issues. They might negotiate this for a bill on the Amazon, doesn't matter. But they are now proposing a new Estatuto da Família, Statute of the Family. They oppose the idea of families in plural. We have fought to have the concept of family in plural. That's what life it is. That's what real life is now. And they oppose that. And also, they are totally against sexual and reproductive rights that has to do directly with women's body, not only women, but directly to women. So we see that these are kind of the most tension in the most targeted areas of life when conservative religion starts to get power. I don't think they will change the Constitution in terms of equality. It would not come to that. But yes, there is dangers in a number of other achievements because this is now a very dramatic moment for human rights in Brazil. We are seeing a dismantling of human rights. And another thing, and with that I end, is the context. We can never place a political action outside of the broader political context of the country and of the world. And the world is dramatically conservative at this moment. The US, which is a country that influences, is dramatically conservative. And so more than ever, this campaign that will start out of the book, out of the film, is not dealing with a traditional old issue family. What is this? No. Family can be very revolutionary, and family is a target for conservatives. So I'm very glad we still don't know how the campaign will be, when the campaign will be launched, but I would like to end asking all the persons that are here to participate in this WLB campaign for equality in the family. Thank you.
I don't want to abuse my prerogative as moderator. Would it be all right if I allow the speakers to address an issue that has come up in the talks, or should I open the, okay, just open the floor to discussion and questions. Are there questions? Yes?
So my name is Danielle, and I'm the program associate for the Gender Equality Initiative.
Oh, could you hold on? We were trying to record things, I guess.
Hi, my name is Danielle, and I'm the program associate for the Gender Equality Initiative at the Elliott School. My question is for Yakin Merhama, hoş geldiniz. So I did my research, my master's dissertation on the rise of violence against women in Turkey in light of deeply entrenched patriarchal values, and I talked a lot about the family law and essentially how it's not enforced because of these patriarchal norms, and how Turkish National Police believe that, you know, violence is an issue that should be left within the home and dealt between the man and woman. So given these issues that are going on and how perpetrators of violence often face little to no accountability, not just in Turkey, but in all of these countries that we've discussed, what, in your opinion, are the best steps and mechanisms that we need to take in order to address deeply entrenched patriarchal values? Because we know this is a root cause of the problem that causes this family law not to be enforced. And we've seen how, you know, men are saying that it's their culture and it's such a challenging issue, and we're still here today trying to battle this issue and address it. But I'm just really curious to hear your thoughts, and any one of you can also jump in on that. Thank you.
It's a very challenging question, and if we can find the answer, I think we solve the problem halfway through. But Turkey went through a very vibrant law reform process, as you know, since you have studied it. Both the civil code and the criminal code, I think, were just remarkable in demystifying what people call culture. It can be done. Generally, it is not culture that is the resistance. It's people who speak on behalf of culture and those in power. And despite those in power, a woman exhibited an incredible force in changing both criminal codes. And some of the most important patriarchal elements, such as property regime, head of the household, etc., these were removed. Marital rape, you know, I would have thought in a country, traditional country like that, this will never go through. It did. So it helps to us, this experience alone helps us to revisit the term culture altogether. That's why I keep talking about patriarchal culture within power. But what happened? Things were moving very well, and a lot of women did make use of the new legal openings. But the whole political spectrum has changed in such a way that women's rights, as in other countries, everywhere. I mean, look, Italian women are on the streets after having had so much success in reproductive rights. Now, some of their rights are being endangered. Not necessarily by a government who's banning, but because of different approach of different sectors where, let's say, abortion is being denied by some doctors. So these are important elements that are across the board, how this conservatism is coming in through in different contexts. That's why I agree with my colleagues that this is a universal problem. It's not a problem in Turkey. I mean, we have one distinct problem, which Americans may say we have something similar to that, Tayyip Erdogan. But what lies beneath that is a current which is happening all over. So I think we need to revisit our activism altogether. Turkish women have been totally sidelined. I mean, after being one of the most vibrant social elements in change in Turkey in the 1990s, 2000, until about 5 years ago. Today they are sidelined, but they're not giving up. They are on the streets with great risks. They're being attacked on the street for the way they're dressed or this or that. So today, I think women's movement is perceived as perhaps more of a threat to the established patriarchal order than terrorism. And we need to develop new mechanisms, transnational mechanisms. We cannot do it alone in Turkey. I think we need to join forces more so than ever without appearing matriarchal from above, or bringing in imperial notions. We need to revisit our activism and try to go beyond borders in responding to these kinds of things. So, as I said at the beginning, we thought we had come a long way. We did. But it's a very dialectical process. Now we're at a stage where we're not fighting to get there. We're fighting, resisting not to lose what we have everywhere. So I think we need new ways of doing things. But it can be done. My 1.5-year-old granddaughter says, I do it. And her 4-year-old sister already does it. So that's what we have to do.
Thank you.
Another question, yes. Back there.
Thank you all very much. My name is Elise Goss-Alexander. I'm a researcher with the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom. Each of you touched on a number of different issues affecting women's rights, from education to son preference to labor force participation and political rights. I was wondering if you could speak a little bit about which of these issues you've seen gain the most traction in sort of broadening the base beyond traditional women's activist communities involving men, involving other communities, and which ones there's been more difficulty in broadening that appeal.
I mean, maybe each one of us can say just a little word on that.
Take a few questions and maybe we can learn.
Okay, would you prefer that? So let's take a group of questions, and then we'll go through and see what people would like to contribute.
Hello. Hi. I'd like to congratulate everybody. This is an awesome panel. And the project of building transnational feminism is extremely difficult, and this is an amazing example precisely of what we need. So I'm very excited to be here and hear these very different presentations. And my question is, out of 100 things I'd like to talk to all of you about, my question is, what do you see as the role of free speech in advancing women's rights now? I'll leave it at that. It's an issue I'm interested in and write about, but free speech and perhaps even, if I dare say, well, I won't go further, but.
Great, thank you. Questions from over here? Yes.
Thank you. My name is Joan Caivano. I'm with the Inter-American Dialogue. And I think I'd like to associate myself with the question that you asked, sort of a strategic question. You know, Jacqueline, I think in Latin America we've seen an appeal to modernity or the separation of church and state as an argument that you make to leaders to respect, for example, abortion rights or reproductive rights or other women's rights. But that no longer has traction, I don't think, with leaders. But there's this other dark force. So what strategy can you have now if we don't share values like modernity or secularism or separation of church and state, these basic sort of liberal democratic values? People are appealing to sort of the lower nature and common fears across globally. So is there something more positive we can try to extract and use as a strategic weapon or sort of a tool to change minds and hearts in the direction, a more progressive direction? And I think this is a question we all grapple with because we all share similar experiences, unfortunately, with our governments. Thank you.
I'm not going to cut off questions, but I don't want to have so many questions that we lose track of what the questions were. So why don't we have a little pause now and see if our group will want to address some of the issues. Joy?
Okay, I start with, thank you. You asked which is the best strategy of, it's difficult to identify which rights to drop and which one, because rights are interrelated. They are interconnected. If you do not attend to the right to education, automatically the right to work, labor, they are also. So what we do is to try to, as much as possible, to push towards attaining these rights. In Nigeria, social and economic rights are non-justiciable. That means you can't go to court and say that your right to education, housing has been violated. But what lawyers have done is to connect each right to the civil and political rights that are like right to food can be connected to right to life. Right to education can be connected to also right to work and so on. That way you can advance. I'll be very careful in selecting one particular right and say, because all rights are inalienable, all rights, they connect to one another. But education is quite key to empowering women to to become self-dependent, to take decisions, to be able to make the decision to leave a violent relationship because they are able to cater for themselves economically. So apart from that, I think education is a key component of advancing women's human rights and combating violence against women.
Thank you. Jacqueline?
Well, I think I will address John's question that was more directed. Because your question, I lose nights thinking what would be really the main strategic value to put on an agenda for change and to respond to this situation. And I think it's secularism. It's the defense of secularism. Because in the defense of secularism in a country that becomes more and more religious, saying that secularism is the only way to assure freedom of religion in a country. Since Brazil is still plural in terms of religion, and also has room for atheists and non-religious, it's like a mantra saying we need to defend the secular state because it is the secular state that defends your freedom of religion or your freedom not to have any religion. And this has a broad appeal. It appeals both to religious persons and it appeals also to civil society at large. And we are trying to do this. If you start to see the agendas of the events, I'm now going to 2 or 3 events in a secular state. Secular state is like the mantra that the movements that are resisting this way of conservative are doing. Now, within this broader and encompassing agenda, you do have women's agenda. And what we are trying to do very much is to defend reproductive rights, including abortion rights that are being threatened because we only have abortion in 3 circumstances. The laws are already very restrictive, and they are being threatened to prohibit abortion in all circumstances. And again, the value, because you construct your agenda on a value that you can bring more people with you, it's democracy and pluralism. You know, saying that sexual and reproductive rights have to do with democracy and pluralism because you are not obliged to have an abortion. You are not obliged to have a child, but you have the right to exercise the right to choose. So choice is a major value that we are also using to reach hearts and minds of the population. Not to speak to us anymore, but the hearts and minds of the population that are being more and more and more and more conquered by this evangelical discourse and narrative of goodness, of having the monopoly of what is considered good and pure and morally superior. It's a very difficult battle, but we are giving it. And in relation to free speech, yes, this is key. I mean, free speech is the basis of freedom. We have in Brazil a very free, democratic press, but there is hate speech too. So we have to have a difference between free speech and hate speech. And hate speech grows with intolerance and conservative. And how do you draw the line? How do you draw the line between hate messages and free speech? I know Germany has just voted a law against hate speech. It's interesting to think about it, and it's a democracy. So
thank you for these excellent questions. Just a few thoughts. First, I want to echo what Jacqueline just said about the importance of secularism. I think that's an absolutely critical piece of this, although I completely take the point, I think it was a very important point, that is one end, but not the end. Then there are ongoing struggles for a democratic secularism and a human rights respecting secularism itself. So that's a very important point as well. But in so many places now, whether it's in the United States, whether it's in Eastern Europe in places like Poland and Hungary, whether it is across the Middle East and North Africa, whether it is in Africa or Latin America dealing with Christian fundamentalism, whether it is in Israel dealing with Jewish fundamentalism, whether it is in India where the Hindu right is in fact in power. This struggle for secularism is absolutely critical. And when it comes to the issue of sort of strategies for confronting fundamentalism and extremism, it's something that I really emphasized in the report. And again, I'm going to bring this up. I need your help because we have an opportunity to actually get a recommendation like this accepted, or at least not rejected at the level of the General Assembly when the report is presented that I referenced. There's a few copies in the back on the 25th of October, but I need people's help in lobbying for that. I make a specific recommendation in the report, which is to provide for and protect the separation of religion and state and to guarantee religious freedom, including the right for women to believe, not to believe, and to change their belief. And to me, the importance of preserving the separation between religion and state goes hand in hand with the importance of preserving the right to freedom of religion or belief, which includes, of of course, the right, as Jacqueline said, not to believe. Now, I was very clear, tried to be very clear in the report that secularism is not an idea that comes from one region of the world, that there are many different forms of secularism that come from all the regions of the world. And I used a quote from a wonderful Indian feminist, Geeta Sahgal, who talks about secularism not meaning the absence of religion, but rather a state structure that defends both, and this brings in the other question, freedom of expression and freedom of religion or belief, where there is no state religion, where law is not derived from God, who may be difficult to negotiate with, as you mentioned, and where religious actors cannot impose their will on public policy. And I'm just back from a mission to Malaysia, and I saw exactly what it looks like to be in a society where increasingly religious actors are imposing their will on public policy to the point where even government cannot really control that process anymore. So I think this is absolutely critical, and if you can't get a copy of the report back here, please, you can go to the Twitter feed for the mandate, which is @UNSR Culture. You can go to the homepage for the mandate. But we have a chance here to get something like this through the General Assembly. If it is pilloried, if it is just roundly criticized in the General Assembly, we will have much more difficulty, I think, really pushing forward at the level of the special procedures on this idea. So I think a critical value to defend right now. Another critical value to defend, or maybe a space, is education. And the fundamentalists understand this. I mean, they focus on education everywhere. Look at what Ghannouchi said in Tunisia. He was talking to a young Salafist, the head of the Ennahda party. He was talking to young Salafists and saying, look, be patient. Focus on changing the education system. Tunisia is not ready for Sharia law yet, but if we pay attention to education, it will be. And we see the Christian fundamentalist targeting of education in many places in Latin America, in the United States, definitely. So I think human rights-minded people, feminists, have to pay more and more attention to education, including at the local levels, school boards, and so on. And when I wrote the book, Your Fatwa Does Not Apply Here, and I interviewed about 300 people from about 30 Muslim-majority countries who were working against fundamentalism, and I always would ask them, what is the most important solution to this problem? And without exception, the first word out of everyone's mouth was education. So I think when we're looking, that doesn't help us with a short-term solution, but when we're thinking about a long-term solution, I think it is such a critical space to protect and a space to have the discussion about values that you're talking about. And that brings me to the freedom of expression question, which I think is a really difficult question and a really crucial one. Again, in the Special Rapporteur's report, I said how important the work of civil society is everywhere in challenging fundamentalism and extremism, and how paradoxical it is that many governments that claim to be fighting fundamentalism and extremism, or at least fighting terrorism, are often putting restrictions on the activities of precisely the civil society advocates who could be most effective in challenging those movements. And one of the areas in which those restrictions are often placed has to do with freedom of expression. So there's a way in which freedom of expression is a critically important piece of this struggle, of the struggles that we saw referenced in the film. And at the same time, I think, and Jacqueline's remarks speak to this, I think we also can't be naive about what the impact of expression always is. Expression, the phenomenon of people being able to express themselves freely is a positive one. What they express may be an extremely negative one, including for human rights. I think part of it, the response has to be through looking at the issue of hate speech. Part of it, I think we have to look very carefully at the limitations which are contained within human rights law itself in Article 19 of the Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, which does allow some limitations on the exercise of rights like freedom of expression to protect the rights of others where that is necessary and in the most limited way possible, because you have to be careful. Limits can swallow a right. And very often the response that you get is, well, if the fundamentalists are using expression, or if various forces, anti-women's rights forces, are using expression against women and women's equality, women's dignity, the answer is more expression. And I certainly think that that's part of it, but the problem is the resource imbalance. right? Women don't have the same, they don't have radio stations and TV stations and newspapers in many places and internet outlets and safety when they take part in expression on the internet. Very interesting work being done by the Due Diligence Project, for example, looking at the issues confronting women expressing themselves and women's rights advocates expressing themselves on the internet. So I think we need to maintain a principled commitment to defending freedom of expression, which is under attack, but we also, I think, have to be vigilant about the human rights impact of some forms of expression as well.
Thank you. Well, I think a lot of my things that I am very passionate about have already been said, but I'll repeat them anyway. But the issue of secularism. I'm a devout secularist, and I believe the struggles should be given within secularism, not at the expense of secularism. But unfortunately, this Western model of moderate Islam and the rising Islamist discourses around the world has really had such a negative impact on secularism. In Turkey, instead of using civil dynamics to improve our secularist understanding, people, even the opposition social democrats, stopped using the term secular because it was the Islamists who were determining the agenda and the language. And only now the progressive and left-wing people are beginning to shake up and start reusing secularism and trying to defend that space because it is constantly being shrunk in my country. And the implications of that shrinking space is incredible. So yes, bad secularism we had perhaps, but let's improve it, not give it up. I think that's key. And secular space is the guarantee for freedom of speech, and I'll take that even further, freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, freedom of peaceful association. These are the three pillars on which civil movements thrived, including women's movements. And all this three space is being taken away. It is really under a great deal of attack in all countries. And I wouldn't be surprised in next 8th of March in many countries, security will be used as a pretext to prevent full activities of women on 8th of March. The street, it wants to be cleansed of women and civil actors. We need to use that street for our activities. So this is the growing tension, I think. And just another question, which I think was, how do we move on women's rights? I have called for, in my own work, and the last report I presented to the Human Rights Council, and again, there's a chapter in the book on this, is to bring back the political economy perspective into understanding what is happening and integrate it into a feminist understanding. Because we assumed that we put away the economic and social and cultural rights aside, and because of the hierarchy of rights within the international system, and concentrated only on civil and political rights. Women's rights are integrated, and women cannot express their freedom of speech or any other political rights or any other right if they do not have economic resources on which they can be independent. And this is where I think civil society and some of the partners of WLP are working in enlarging that economic basis of women's rights. And this is absolutely crucial. If women don't have the means, they cannot even dare to be independent and say their minds. So it's a multifaceted level of struggle, isn't it? But I think some of the things we cherished before and forgot because other values came and sort of crushed over them, we need to revisit them, bring them back to our activism. Thank you.
Thank you. Is it time? I want to thank our panelists for their wonderful contributions and to thank the audience for some very thoughtful and provocative questions.
I just want to thank, first of all, our wonderful moderator, Anne Mayer, who wasn't introduced. She's the Associate Professor Emeritus at the Wharton School of the University of Pennsylvania, and she's written one of the most influential books on human rights called Islam and Human Rights. I just wanted to do that. Just to sum up the conversation as well as the documentary, what we want to do in this campaign that we've introduced to you today is to point out, and I think they have done it beautifully, just to say it in a couple of words, is that the forces that are for patriarchy, top-down decision-making, and all of the other ramifications of that have become more and more global, using some of the technology and communications vehicles that have come about that have all kinds of positive aspects, but at the same time very negative ones. These forces are not only global, but they're very cohesive and comprehensive. As you saw, Sean Connery trying to suffocate a woman, charming as he is and attractive as he is, and the beautiful statues and all of that. Art, cinema, literature, religion, mythology, politics, economy, everything has gone to reinforce this top-down, power-oriented, really violent cultures that have been produced and that have dominated our way of life. So in order for us to have a comprehensive response to that, we can't be divided. I'm afraid that the feminist movement has really trying to be responsive to the different segments of society with their different interests and different problems. We have become splintered into such little tiny groups, while we are half of the population and more. So we contain all of the minorities. We are red, black, white. We are rich, poor. We are all the indigenous populations. We are disabled. We are very able. We have all of those within us. So let's speak for the entire population when we speak for things that we know that the entire population of the earth would want. And the other thing is that the terms that we talked about secularism, but there are others like feminism. These terms have been systematically devalued and articulated in a sense that it means something other than what we had in mind. Let's try to co-opt those terms once again and redefine them. Feminists do not hate men. Feminists hate violence. Feminists are not limited to any particular group, Western or whatever. Let's reclaim these terms and try to articulate them in the real meaning that we have in mind. And again, secularism was another term that has come to mean atheism. And it has come to mean the worst aspects of Western culture, looseness, not having any interest in a community or family or so forth, or religious values, which is not the case. So I think that for our global campaign, we'll have to have some of that cohesion that we want and the global reach that we want. And that's why WLP, for instance, which has gone through doing this work, has so many different faces and so many different life conditions. And we're hoping that we'll be able to get the collaboration of others to spread this as far as we can. So I know that everybody wants to get back to work, and our people have to catch planes, a lot of them, and go long distances. So I just want to thank the Johns Hopkins, as usual. They have been wonderful, and they have done a whole lot to organize this. And I want to also thank once again the speakers and also the partners. And the staff of WLP, who are wonderful, very small group doing such large and important things with so much passion and so much compassion. So I wanted to thank them. And also I want to thank our IDRC, the organization that has really helped us create both the anthology, which will be published next year, the studies in 10 countries and, actually 13 all in all, both in the sense of research and also interviews, in-depth interviews, which will go into the anthology, the film, and everything else about this particular initiative, and it's a very important initiative, so we're very thankful for that. And so please join us in this effort. And we count on all of you and all of the friends that you will hopefully draft into this particular struggle. And also, one more thing. All of the people that talked talked about our miseries and our struggles and what we fought and how men have really wiped us out completely in many different areas. As we keep saying, we want men to support us and join us. I think we should somehow point out why this happened. A couple of people in the film mentioned it. It wasn't as if a bunch of the population decided to really give a hard time to the other half, whom they love and have passion about and have children with and all of that. It didn't happen that way. At one time, it was necessary. Women were either constantly pregnant or and their children would die in childbirth or early age, and then they wouldn't survive. And women were either breastfeeding or being pregnant, and so they couldn't do the kind of work that men were doing. And also work required a different sort of circumstance. You had to have physical stamina or whatever. So the division of labor and all of that was part of this. It's much more complicated than that. But the most simple, essential reason is that history was a different history. At one point, it wasn't such a horrible thing. It was more or less normal. It changed because life changed and history changed. So now we have to get it out of our head. Sean Connery, the beautiful statues, the stories, the poems, and all of that. It's all a man's world, you know. Who was it that said that? James, I don't know James Brown. So a man's world. So we have to come together and change that. So let's remember, it hasn't always been like that. And when it started, there was a reason, and now there is good reason to end it. So let's work together to change that. And thank you all so much, the partners who come a long way, those who have come a shorter way, but nevertheless sat and watched carefully and given us all your attention. And thank you very much. Bye-bye now.